Welcome back to Raised by Giants, where we talk all things spirituality. I'm Ryder Lee. Tonight we have very special guest, former director of the Stargate remote viewing unit at Fort Meade, Dale Graff, speaking about uncovering the Stargate, tracks in the psychic wilderness. But before I introduce him, check out Raised by Giants on Rokfin. It is a completely uncensored platform. Go over there, set up a free account, get all of my regular content I post here on YouTube, and sign up for Rokfin's premium content, which is far less than a YouTube premium account, at only $10 a month. And you'll get all of my premium uncensored content when it gets released, and all of the other creators' premium content as well, like Beyond Classified, Charlie Robinson, Jay Dyer, Zero with Sam Tripoli, Tinfoil Hat, Eddie Bravo, and Rex Bear Leak Project, and much more. Check the link in the description to sign up for the video streaming platform, Rokfin. Also, check out C60 Purple Power. It is the most powerful antioxidant on the planet, helps with energy levels, skin problems, infections, eyesight, brain cognition, EMF radiation, and a lot more. It's a free radical sponge that gives your body the ability to heal itself. And if you use promo code GIANTS10 from the link in the description, you'll get 10% off your entire purchase. I highly recommend it. I've been using it for over a year with my own money, and I wouldn't recommend something that doesn't work. Introducing tonight's guest, Dale Graff. Dale E. Graff is a researcher, writer, and speaker internationally known for his insights into the processes of the mind. He was a director of the Stargate Project, the government's program for research and applications of remote viewing, an aspect of extrasensory perception. He coined the name Stargate to symbolize an innovative effort of exploration and expand the range of human potential. He is recognized for his understanding of natural psi talents as being a spectrum available while awake, conscious state psi, CSP, and while asleep and dreaming, dream state psi, DSP. His books, Tracks in the Psychic Wilderness and River Dreams, have brought him international recognition as he describes his personal evolution from scientific doubter to that of accepting the reality of psi abilities. His books have been praised for their honesty and for the way he presents psychic experience in a neutral perspective, free of dogma and belief systems. He has been interviewed for several national and international programs and documentaries. Hello and welcome to the show, Dale. It's an honor and a privilege to speak with you. Thanks so much for coming on. How are you?
Yeah, I'm fine. And I want to thank you for having me come over to you and visit and talk about a topic that's dear to my heart. So thank you.
Yes, no problem. Angela Ford actually hooked us up, and I'm very grateful for that. She's a lovely person, and I've really been digging deep into the Stargate project and trying to interview as many people that are still alive that were a part of the project, because I really feel like the investigation into psychics and remote viewers tends to be, overlooked a lot, and people don't really understand how important this was and how much misinformation about the project that's really been thrown about online with people that weren't even involved in the project itself, talking about portals and time travel and stuff. I don't know if you've listened to any of that ridiculous stuff, which I think that is just an operation to farther try and discredit the program. And then I've also ran into, discrepancies between the people that were actually involved in the unit themselves. So it's been a pretty tricky thing to really navigate. But you were the director of this program, the DIA's Stargate program, from 1976 until 93. Is that correct?
Actually, I was involved in the effort from almost the very beginning. The initial research started in 1972 and I became involved directly in 1976 and stayed with the effort, that is remote viewing research and applications in different roles, ranging from simply coordinating effort between different agencies to defining tasks and just simply exploring the phenomenon. And eventually, I did become the director of Stargate. That was later on in the program, 1989 to 1993. But up until that time, I had a direct hand in pretty much all of the activities in different roles. I originally started with an intelligence organization at the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, the Foreign Technology Division, and then I transferred to the Defense Intelligence Agency in Washington, D.C., where I continued my role with more responsibilities. But while I was at the Foreign Technology Division, I became the contract manager for the remote viewing research to continue the effort that had been ongoing there since 1972. And I helped maintain that research effort from inside the government through actually helping to define the objectives, writing contracts, work statements, that sort of thing. And then later became involved in the operational activities, which is really what Stargate was about. Can we apply the phenomenon that we call remote viewing?
Now, because from my understanding, it was a Army intelligence program in the very beginning, and then it got transferred to the DIA. So, when did this project very first begin? Because it's
Okay,
very
so
difficult trying to track down the exact date that it
yeah,
actually became a program.
I can give you an exact timeline here. The research effort, the strictly research, began in 1972 at the Stanford Research Institute in Menlo Park, California. And at that time, there were some operational projects that were, you might say, sponsored by the CIA. But the CIA only stayed with the effort for about a year and a half. And then the researchers at SRI started looking for funding and support, and that's when they came to our organization with the Air Force. And that was in 1976. And that's when I became involved directly as the contract manager. And then, almost coincidentally, you might say, in 1979, 1980, the Army set up a unit at Fort Meade specifically aimed at the operational aspects. So that was the second part of the remote viewing activities in the government. And we had the research continued as it basically had been set up at SRI throughout the whole time frame, but the operational part didn't really start in full force until 1979. That's when the Army Intelligence Command set it up at Fort Meade, Maryland. Now that unit, that Army unit, of course, I worked with them directly through FTD and also through the Defense Intelligence Agency. But that effort continued until about 1985, when the Army transferred it to the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency. So I became then directly involved with both the research and the research because it was, and the operations, because it was now part of the Defense Intelligence Agency. So from 1985 till the program closed, it was under one management function, even though the operational activity remained in place at Fort Meade, Maryland. We used the same facilities, we just rented it from the Army. So, but it was a DIA activity from 1985 onward.
And from my understanding, too, you had a direct hand with Dr. Verona, and you two were kind of responsible for keeping the program running in 1984, whenever the Army was trying to shut it down, right?
Yes, right. In fact, the option at that time in 1984, when I forgot the name of the general, but when he decided to shut it down, I think it was General Odom at Fort Meade, the option was to close down and transfer the people to some other duty in the Army. or keep whatever the ability was that had been developed over the years since 1979 and transfer them to our agency. So Dr. Verona and I got together and decided that we'll prepare the justification, what we call the position descriptions, and all the paperwork that goes along with developing what looks like new activity from the budget point of view. And we prepared that paperwork package, a personnel request package, and we were able to then get Congress to approve it. And in about a year's time, the unit was totally transferred. The people came with it then to the DIA. So yes, we were the ones that developed all the requirements to keep it going.
Now, also, Dr. Verona was also sending money to help fund the SRI, right, and research the psi and ESP abilities before the unit was transferred to DIA in 1985.
The funding profile in the Department of Defense began with the contract I was involved in 1976 when I became the chief, when I became the director of the research, the contracts with SRI. So that was an Army, that was an Air Force funded effort. Now, between 1976 and I think it was about 1979, maybe 1980, there were other elements that contributed from either from the Army or the Air Force. I think the Navy had a small hand in it. So there were a number of military elements that contributed. Now, DIA started supporting the funding about 1979, 1980 also. And from about 1980 onward, or it might have been 1982, they actually provided most of the funding to keep the research alive. But so it was a number of people were involved, a number of sources for the funding were involved in keeping the research alive. But the DIA had the major part of it, especially from 1980 onward.
Yeah, I'm just trying to really track a lot of this down and figure out, an accurate timeline of events, because I think it's really important. And like you said, with Sidney Gottlieb was the director of the MK Ultra programs too, and he was also funding SRI. And then I think Dr. Verona was former CIA, and then he transferred to DIA. And I was just trying to figure out, when all of this funding really happened to SRI, and then how that developed into the Army intelligence, Stargate project, which, from my understanding, it wasn't just always called the Stargate Project, right? It went under many different names and different titles, and then whenever someone would figure out that the Army intelligence or the DIA was using psychics or remote viewers and channelers and mediums and all this, they would just come in and switch the name and then continue operations. Is that correct?
Well, really, the research part was never under a special access. That was either confidential, secret, or whatever, or even unclassified. So the research part that was done at SRI, unless there was some really special project, was not under the special access names. Now, when the Army set up the unit at Fort Meade, Maryland, around 1979, they actually developed a code word in order to regulate the people that were known or approved for knowing about this, and also for controlling access to the names. We didn't want people on the outside of government knowing that so-and-so was working in the remote viewing field. So we had to do that to protect the people. So the code words, almost by requirement, had to be changed routinely. That's part of the regulations for how the government regulates special access control words, and about every 3 years you change them. So as a result, there were about 3 different names applied to the activity at Fort Meade from about 1979 till about 1986, or so, when the unit was transferred. And that's the time when I created the new term Stargate, mainly because I didn't like the words that were available, which you pick out of a predefined book that the Department of Defense Security gives you to choose from. And I didn't like those the words. They were kind of silly, I thought, and it didn't really represent what we were doing. So I came up with the name Stargate. I had to actually get approval through the Secretary of Defense to use a new code word for the special access activity that we had. That was, since it wasn't in an approved book, I had to get special approval to use the word Stargate. So then from there on, 1986, 87 onward, the Ford Meade activity code word, Stargate was applied to the Ford Meade activity, which is really for the operational unit and the projects that we worked on. The research part was not under the name Stargate, but it was supporting the Stargate operational effort. So that's sort of the evolution of the code words. There were other words like Center Lane, Gondola Wish, and a few others that were used, but Stargate was the one that remained the longest and was the last one. And I guess I'm happy to say I was the one that had a hand in creating it, because I always liked the name, and I've been sometimes accused of borrowing it from that movie Stargate. And there's a book that came out shortly thereafter called The Stargate Conspiracy. But I had no knowledge of that. It was just sort of an independent situation. You might call it a coincidence. The Stargate unit for me, that name occurred at least a year before that movie came out.
Yeah, I think there was a couple through the research that I done too. There was a couple of others, Sunstreak, I believe, and Syndicate or something like that. There's like 4 or 5 different names
Yeah,
that
Sunstreak is one of them. Yeah, Sunstreak, Center Lane, Gondola Wish, and there was another one. Yeah, there were words like that. They're just words. They're just this is
right.
used to control the access, and of course the documents were marked with them, so that we could keep control of the paperwork that was flowing in and out too. So it's just a way of keeping control of the activity, who knew about it, and to actually shield us from people that might not like the concept of people that have this kind of ability working on a government project. Because in the 70s, any discussion in any kind of mostly scientific circle that brought up the topic of psychic abilities was not a very good thing to bring up. There was a lot of negativity, a lot of this is foo-foo stuff, the fantasy, and because that's in the conventional scientific side. But what a lot of people don't realize is like this almost a half a century, or almost 2/3 of a century of solid research going on in the field of these kinds of abilities, like called by extrasensory perception that J.B. Ryan initiated at Duke University in 1929. And there were other places of research where this work was going on, but it was not widely known by the general public. So we came into, I guess you might say, improve the visibility of a natural phenomenon that we all have. And we do have this ability, and it's you can call it advanced intuition. You can call it a form of extrasensory perception, which is really what remote viewing is. We just put a format around it and a procedure. But the general overall umbrella for the term and for the phenomenon, you could call it extrasensory perception. It's still a good term. Remote viewing is a little bit more specific and helps define a process and maybe a certain technique. But if you look at the basic phenomenon, it's just like gravity. How many ways can you define gravity?
Absolutely, I agree 100%. So, back really quick before we move forward. So, this kind of started out with SRI, right? And from my understanding, I'm not sure if it was just one event or if it was multiple events, but there was an event that happened that is what got Army intelligence and the DIA and these 3-letter organizations interested in creating or developing an actual program to study this and use psychics and remote viewings as a data collections, intelligence collections thing. And from my understanding, there was a couple of events, but from one of them was an event with SRI where Pat Price and Ingo Swann both remote viewed a top secret military base in West Virginia. Is this correct? And that's kind of what got the three-letter organizations interested in developing a remote viewing program, special access program.
Yes, I think you could say that's generally correct. You have to get attention at these levels. You have to actually show some evidence. And what Pat Price did, and certainly Ingo Swann as well around that time, but Pat Price was the one that came up with a description of a remote Soviet nuclear research site, and that really was an advanced thing at the time. And he had a very accurate description. This is fairly well publicized in the community now. So that got the attention of the CIA, because at that time they were still sponsors. But what really got their attention later on in another project was when Pat Price described details of a secret facility in the U.S. and even came up with words that related to highly classified code words. So those two events, and I'm sure there are other. I think there were other contributors. The research itself supported the fact that there was something that could be quantified. That led to the attention of the CIA, but of course they didn't continue it. So it was abandoned because of political issues, the way I understand it, and that the funding sources for SRI were coming out of a part of CIA that was involved in some other activities that were not what you might say well received by review committees, and that part was closed down. I think that goes back to that MK Ultra situation. But whatever the situation, the research limped along a little bit with private supports until Hal Putoff and Russell Card came to the Foreign Technology Division where I was at that time and made their presentation, and that led to the Air Force picking up the funding to keep the research alive, and we continued it, not so much from the operational side at that time, because our organization was more analysis and more research oriented, and not so much operational, although we did have operational elements. So we continued it just to see if there really was a way of quantifying the phenomenon. But as we got into it, interesting applications came up, and that got people even ignited the attention even more, including what was visible, what the Defense Intelligence Agency was interested in, because they were following what we were doing. In fact, I was the one that kept them up to date mostly. It was an incident at FTD, the Foreign Technology Division, when I was the contract manager for the SRI research, an opportunity for doing a operational project did come up, even though this is not what we had planned to do. It was one of those situations that was a moment of opportunity, and that was, could we find an airplane that was missing in Africa? Well, we didn't know it was missing in Africa. We just knew that there was a missing airplane. And we went through the protocol, and the person I was working with was really a high talented individual that didn't really need any training whatsoever right off. She could do this right off the street, so to speak. And she came up with a very good description that later on allowed the search team to locate the airplane, which was in Africa. This was a highly classified operational activity to locate this missing. It was a Soviet airplane, by the way, in Africa. There was a defector flying it south, trying to get as far away as he could. plane ran out of fuel. He bailed out, but the plane kept going. And the Air Force, because we had at Air Force, we had the responsibility for analyzing foreign aircraft and the capabilities. So it was basically a foreign technology Air Force team that was sent into Africa. CIA teams members also came along, and it was information we provided to them. I got them to actually pin down and get over to where the airplane was located. Otherwise, we wouldn't have found it. We would not have been able to get to it and get the equipment out in time before having to leave the country. So that incident really got attention, both good and bad. so, and then of course later I transferred to the DIA and we continued on with the mix of supporting research and also working with whatever operational projects were reasonable and were identifiable. Dr. Verona and I had set up a working group which had representatives from all of the service departments there, and their task was to nominate potential operational projects or tasks for us to work on. So that's how we kept the tasking rolling. After, and particularly more so after we became directly involved. Prior to that time, we had a close link with the Army people, and also provided suggestions for operational tasks, which ranged from straight operational. Can you find something? Can you define something at a distance that might be a security threat, all the way to something technological? So it was a mix of tasks that we worked on throughout those years.
So was Russell Targ and Hal Puthoff any way involved with the Stargate project directly or at any official capacity, or were they just working and getting funding for SRI?
The only people within the government were officially connected with the code word unit with the special operational task or activity. Now we could bring people in from time to time, and we did, but the SRI team was not part of the operational unit. They did not have the caveats that we applied to special access requirements. But they were, of course, we saw them as a co-worker, so to speak. So we defined what we thought would be a reasonable tasks or areas for them to investigate from a research point of view that in theory should help us understand how to improve the understanding of remote viewing and how to apply it. So they were sort of an arm in principle to help the research or to help the operational unit. Now, of course, eventually they did some independent research, did not connect up at all with us. That came from other sources, so they were not part of Stargate or the activity that we were supporting through the Defense Intelligence Agency's avenue, sources.
So you were in the project way before anyone that I have spoken to so far. So I know that you said that you were in it before 1976, but whenever in 1976, let's just roll with that date for now. Whenever you got there in 1976, who all was a part of the unit? Because from my understanding, there was only maybe 4 to 10 people there in total since the time that it started until the time that it ended in 1995.
Well, in 1976, there was no code word unit. That wasn't established till around 1979.
Yeah.
And so the initial unit there at Fort Meade, Maryland, which was really Army personnel, I think they had the code word condolent wish at that time. And that was a small unit, and it grew a little bit over time. I think ultimately, when I became involved, we had received some additional funding from congressional sources. And when the unit was transferred from the Army personnel department to the defense system in 1985, 86, and of course Dr. Verona, who had to approve all this, created additional positions for more support in the office area, as well as for other positions that we were envisioning could be filled by Navy personnel or some other service, not just Army. Because the people I transferred in from Army remained as Army officers, even though they were working for DIA. And when we transferred the unit and increased the number of billets, we were up to maybe 12 at that time, which included support staff, more data analysts. We had a computer support issue to resolve. How do you how do you keep track of all this stuff? How do you evaluate and how do you you don't want to lose track of this stuff? So how do you really manage it? So there's a lot of that data management stuff that we had to develop at that time. So that was probably the maximum number in the unit at the time. The people that actually did what we call operational viewing might have been maybe 6 at the most, as I remember. It might have varied around that, but that was basically the composition. And then it decreased over time, and then ultimately it was just sort of a core group that remained toward the end of the activity in 1995.
Yeah, from the people that I can track down and the people that I've interviewed so far, Lynn Buchanan was there from 84 to 92. David Morehouse was there from 87 to 91. And Angela Ford was there from 86 to 95.
David Morehouse was not there during that period of time. That's too long. He was only there for about a year and a half. So in the actual unit itself, he was not there that long. Now, Lynn Buchanan was there, and then he was transferred out and then came back in. And that's usually the case with Army personnel. They don't want to keep you in a unit, any unit, wherever you are in the Army or any of the military services. It's policy not to keep an officer in one place more than 3 years. Four would be long, or maybe, and you'd rotate them around. So we had to relinquish the military people from time to time, but they came back in. Some of them, Mel Riley did, Lynn Buchanan did. Trying to remember, I don't know if any of the others came back in, but some of them were only in there for a short period of time, like David Morehouse.
So, from my understanding, there was only a few people that were civilians that was in the program, like one or two civilians, and the rest were military personnel and military officers, right?
Yeah, at the time the Army had it. Yes, it was more military because it was an Army operational intelligence collection unit, basically linked with Army INSCOM. But there were civilian support staffs, secretaries and I think there might have been one or two others. And then when I became involved and we had additional billets, then we did have we had more civilians that helped out. So we were trying to get more of a balance in there, but it was mostly. You're right. It was mostly Army, or I should say, a military staffed unit. And in terms of the military people, it really was mostly Army. I think at one time there was a Navy person there, but that was really early in the program.
Was Ingo Swann ever in the program? Because there's discrepancies here between the people that I've interviewed and the research that I've done. Some people say that he was involved in the program directly, and some people say that he was never in the program, and then he was in it in the early days, and then he wasn't in it. So you were the officer of this program for quite a long time, so you would know if he was involved. So was Ingo involved in the Project Stargate at all?
Well, there were times when they were operational projects that came up that I'm almost certain, and I know for a fact, we did task Ingo to work on them, and others at SRI too. I think Gary Langford was one. There might have been a few others. So yeah, we could reach out tasking to almost anyone if we wanted to, but either we had to make sure they understood it was an operational project and the information to be kept under the control of the special access requirements. We could have gone to almost anyone if we wanted to, but obviously we had to tell the individuals something about the activity. So we had to keep it within people that had classified, that were already classified, or at least working in a classified area like Inga. But Inga was never actually, what you might say, a part of the code word activity. We may have been brought in from time to time on a special task, and that's for other people at SRI as well that we did.
Yeah, from what I've researched, he was sort of a part of training some of these military personnel on the protocols of remote viewing. Is that correct?
Yes, of course, and in fact, there was a contract that we let to him. I think the Army initiated it, and then we continued part of that. So yes, he was brought in to develop his training program, and that's at that time, of course, he was um, read onto the program. He had to be, but it was not officially assigned as a Stargate personnel. He's just working for the overall activity to develop a training program, and we had people actually go to SRI to go through the protocol, and you might say an early form of training or screening occurred there. And then later on, Ingo did have an activity, probably based out of New York. I don't think he did all of it at SRI, where some of the people from the project actually went there to go through his protocol, his training techniques. So sure, we had that. You might call that a coordinated kind of effort that we would use from time to time whenever the needs arose, and that was one of them. Finding a way to develop the talent maybe quicker and more efficient. Some of the early people probably didn't really need a lot of training because they were really good from the very beginning, like Joe, and then some of the early ones, other early ones, and then that might have been mainly because the screening programs, identified them very easily, very quickly. Maybe we were just lucky. I don't know. So yeah.
During this project, was there like a manual or a set of protocols or something that was developed in order for the military assets that are involved in the project to be able to remote view, or did that come later? How did that all develop? Was there a manual that, I mean, obviously, you just said that Ego had like a protocol that he had kind of developed and helped the Army intelligence. But was there an overall kind of manual or a program that, like a step by step, right? Was there like, oh, this is what you do, this is how you do it, for anybody that would be coming into
Basically,
the program?
yes, basically that's what came out of what Inga was working on with the SRI people, and ultimately you could say it developed into a procedure and put into a manual, if you want to call it that. So yeah, but that's not what we had initially. But this did evolve, and whether you call it a manual or training document or whatever, it did have the basic steps that Ingo and I think maybe some of the researchers at SRI helped work with him on. Yeah, so that then became a part of the documentation. Of course, now it's been floating around. It was probably released a number of times already through FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act, and now is available through different training techniques that people have adapted and modified it to some extent, from what I can tell. So the versions of it exist now in different forms.
So when you were read into this program? Because again, from my understanding, you have to be read into a special access program. They tell you, really what's going on, what you're going to be doing. What was the statement that they gave you that was the mission of this program? Like, what did they flat out tell you that it was that you were going to be involved in, collecting intelligence data for military and three-letter organization operations? Or was it something else?
Well, initially, we didn't have that. We just sort of evolved in that direction. But when the Army set up the operational unit at Fort Meade, Maryland, they did have statements like that for people that, as you call it, admitted or right into the project. Now, I wasn't directly involved with that step, so I don't know the precise wording of what they had the participants read. Sounds reasonable from what you're saying. That's probably what happened. Later on, we just simply explained to people what we were doing. Of course, we didn't have a huge recruitment effort. So how many people over the years are you talking about here? So it really wasn't an issue. You just talk to people and explain what we're doing. And here is the nature of the program. And do you want to come on board or not? And if we got people from within the agency that already had clearances, top secret clearances, it really wasn't too much of an issue. But if we were trying to find people that were not, doesn't have the highest classification levels, and then we had to be a little more careful with how we stated it.
Now, how would they find a good candidate for this program? What would be the processes that they would go through to find somebody that would be good for this program and this unit? Was there like some kind of testing, some kind of standardized testing if someone would go in, or would if they would describe some kind of experiences to their superior officer or something, and then they would be like, hey, I think that you would be a really good applicant for this other program that we're using that
Yeah, sometimes that's the way it works. You have to realize we're not out advertising. We have to look around. We didn't want anybody to, even those within highly classified areas of the facility, to really know what this activity was about. There's always the issue of if certain congressional people or other management level people know that we're working with, as they might have called it, psychics. That would have been not a good thing to get around. So we got to be really careful on how we let people know or search for people that could have their talents. And early on in research, and I'm going back outside of the government work here, but this work has been done in the various parapsychological laboratories over the past century now, that did indicate that individuals that have certain experiences in childhood or whatever, or were good dreamers or whatever, would tend to do better in the parapsychological kind of testing that was used at the time. So we had a little bit of an idea that you talk to people, find out what the experiences were, and if they're willing to talk about it, that's a step forward right there. It means they're kind of comfortable with the topic, and then you learn about what the nature of the experience was, and then you go to the next step. So that's one way of doing it, and you start that, and then initially, I think some of the early people that came into the program, that's how they were located. And then the early groups from the Army then were, that came out of a questionnaire that was passed around at the Fort Huachuca, I believe, narrowing down 125 that responded fairly favorably, or that had indications that they had an interest and talent, down to 5 or so. And then there's 5, or it might have been more, it might have been 10. Then they were sent for further evaluation to the researchers at SRI and put through basic procedures out there. The typical way that we did it then was, can you describe this scene or that activity or whatever? And and then those that did really well there, and went on into the unit. So, and then ultimately later, as time went on, it was pretty much what commanders that knew what we were doing, identified in the people in the ranks in their own workforce, or something they heard about an individual. Maybe this is not a scientific way of doing it, but given the constraints that we have, we don't have a big advertisement happening here. Can't do that.
Yeah, because you couldn't advertise it. Yeah, it's
Don't have something hanging out in the Wall Street Journal and say apply to DIA for position as a remote viewer. We didn't have anything like that going. I'm sure we would have been swamped if we had. But nevertheless, there I'm not happy with the way we did it later on. There were some issues that came up. We should have been maybe more circumspect, but we had issues. How do we really find people? And normally when you're doing recruiting, for any kind of task, there are always uncertainties. But as time goes on, then you can evaluate what directions you're going to go in with that individual. Do they remain or do they get transferred? So that kind of thing. So that's another issue.
So, was there ever any lie detector tests that were ever administered to any of the people that were in the unit? Because I remember Russell Targ talking about that him and Putoff were put under, some kind of lie detector test for some kind of special access program, and which you're saying we already discussed that Russell Targ and Hal Putoff wasn't directly involved in the Stargate project. I'm just trying to figure out if this was something that was carried over into the Stargate project, or if it was just something that was involved with SRI.
I think what you're talking about must have occurred very early on with the CIA involvement, and it was a Pat Price situation when he described this secret facility. But after that, I've no knowledge of anything like that being applied to the people at SRI, and certainly not to anyone within the government in the operational units.
Cool. Thanks for clearing that up. So, what were some of the, just to get a baseline of kind of what the program was about? Can you reveal some of the targets the remote viewers in the unit were asked to collect intelligence information on? The project's been basically declassified, so if you have any specific targets or anything that you can disclose to the audience of intelligence information.
Sure, there are quite a few. And I think I mentioned one of the early ones. Well, of course, the one with Pat Price is a classic. But when the next period of time was what I call the Air Force, the foreign technology years, from 1976 to 1980, roughly. That was the airplane, finding the airplane. That was a big one. And then there were some smaller ones in there, but they were focused on locating airplanes, and not just foreign airplanes, but U.S. airplanes that were lost. And we did do projects with that, but you call that operational intelligence. Then when the Army really stood up in full force there at Fort Meade, sure, there were some really interesting projects that the Army had identified, and CIA had suggested some, NSA had some. And one big one was the one about predicting the emergence of a very large submarine that no one had anticipated at that time. That was, I think that's the one that Joe McMoneagle did. That's fairly well known. We talked about, and now there were other projects at that time. I'm talking about in the early days, 1979, 1980, 81. having to do with locating bugs or hidden devices in embassies, locating people that might have been informers, that sort of human type of intelligence. And the technical parts, when the DIA became more involved in it, it shifted more toward the technical intelligence side. What is being developed and so facility, and they include lasers, it include high energy weapons, some basic research, or what is the yield of a certain warhead on the emerging Soviet ICBM, that sort of thing. And then this evolved later on when we expanded the scope of the activities to the Customs Department. This involved locating fugitives and tracking narcotics shipments, and things having to do with illegal trade. So we had activity there. We still call that intelligence collecting. Maybe it's not so much for a foreign adversary, but for threats to the U.S., for that matter. So locating people, locating missing individuals, missing airplanes, anticipating capabilities of certain laser systems. What is the activity of certain remote site? And then, of course, there were things involved people too. Where is so-and-so? Where is this fugitive, or where is this terrorist? So there's a wide range of activities over the years that we took on as an operational task.
So, talking to Lynn Buchanan, he said that there was basically a time in the unit where a few remote viewers basically drew out entire floor plans for a foreign building that I'm not 100% sure on exactly what it was, because I can't remember at this very moment. But they drew out all the floor plans for this foreign building that they didn't have any intelligence data on, and then that data was actually used by either the military or a three-letter organization. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, early on there were activities like that. I wasn't directly involved in those, but I certainly was on the outside or on the periphery looking in. Sure, there were sketches, there were projects that involved locating things, which meant sketching plans of buildings and rooms, and is the object located here or there or whatever. Yeah, there were activities like that. So I'm not sure exactly how many, but there were some of those. Also early on, one of the big projects that I became involved in too, even though I was not directly with the Fort Meade unit at the time. This was 1982, I think. Yes, that was when General Dozier was abducted. Actually, that was in December of 1981. And he was a general that was stationed at Ravenna, Italy, part of a NATO base, been abducted by a terrorist group, and actually held captive for like 44 days. So we did some work on that to locate, hopefully to provide information that would lead to his rescue. We had fairly accurate data. Of course, the actual operation was in the hands of the Italian authorities. All we could do was pass on information. We don't know if they really acted on anything or not. The general was fortunately saved through an informant, capturing an informer who gave the exact address. So we can't take credit for anything, but for that effort. But we also can point to it and say there were some interesting pieces that could have led to his rescue had nothing else come along. So it was an exercise in and feasibility. And we learned a lot from that, what could go wrong and what could be useful. So it was a valuable experience. But I can't log that one in as a big operational success. It was just sort of one of those things that was interesting to do. It could really important to do. But and there were other times too when we were called in to locate a hostage somewhere in the Mideast, for example, and best we could do there was maybe state of health or maybe he's already been murdered, that kind of thing. We were involved in the Iran hostages situation. That went on for 444 days until President Carter came in or left. So that was that was one of the early projects that went on for a long period of time, with some interesting data coming out of that from a predictive point of view.
Yeah,
So
I butchered what he was talking about, so I didn't explain it properly. I probably should have thought that out a little bit more about talking about the actual operation that he was talking about, because there was a lot more information. I just basically gave you the cliff notes on that one and what I could remember. But yeah, so before we get into like how remote viewing works and all that, let's put a little let's put a close to the the Stargate stuff, and because I think we've done a really good job describing it so far. But my last question on this topic really is, why did the CIA shut down the project? I mean, that's the biggest question that probably anybody has that's done any research on this topic at all. And from my understanding, the CIA kind of said that they shut it down because they were like, oh, there wasn't any valuable intelligence data that was ever collected from the unit, and they ultimately shut it down. Now, why would they do that, right? Why would they keep the program running for so long to just shut it down by saying that there wasn't any valuable intelligence data collected when the CIA was actually funding SRI this entire time, right? When does the three,
no,
when
no,
does
no, you got this all wrong. The CIA was not funding this program the entire time.
they were funding SRI the entire time?
Initially, only for the first year and a half to 2 years. After that, the CIA had no funding involvement whatsoever. This is a big misperception here. The CIA only had involvement in 1972 to 1973. And then there was independent people that kept the research alive. And then the Air Force came along in 1976, and then the DIA and other DIA resources brought into it from other elements of DIA of the Department of Defense. And the CIA was not involved. They from that time, from that early time after
Well, not at the
1970.
time, not at the time in the 90s, not, but in the, like you said, in the very beginning. I'm pretty sure for an extended amount of time, longer than a year, because up until the time Pat Price died in 1975, they did stop the funding. I'm pretty sure for a period of time there.
It was only a small amount of funding, and it might have run for, my records show about a year and a half to 2 years, but I'm not going to quibble over that. My point I'm trying to make is, from that early time frame, and whether you want to call it 1974, 1975, from that period until 1995, or shortly before it was closed down in 1995, maybe go back maybe a year or even less, the CIA had no involvement in it. They were not funding it. They didn't provide any personnel. It was all in the Department of Defense. Now, occasionally there might have been a task that was brought into it by a CIA representative, but that was strictly a Department of Defense activity. So when to say it was a CIA program is absolutely wrong.
Right. I wasn't saying that it was a CIA program. I'm saying that the CIA had a hand in funding it in the beginning. So that would make them already aware of researching psychic phenomenon and ESP phenomenon.
Yeah, but then in 19, you asked the original question was, why was it shut down? Okay. Um, this is basically a political issue. The commander at the time at the Defense Intelligence Agency actually detested this topic, and he was an Army general, and he had been earlier in the Army area, in the Army command sections, and was directly or indirectly responsible for having the Army unit shut down in 1984. So he just 10 years later he comes back to the DIA as a director, and just want to continue this unit, this activity. I was in the meeting with Dr. Verona when he learned more details about what we were doing at Fort Meade, and he pretty much said, I thought I got rid of that a long time ago. So you could see what was happening. When he became the director of DIA, he did not want it. So he did everything possible to have it out of his hair, so to speak. So he found a way to have it transferred to the CIA for the final phases. And now the CIA director at the time was no fan of the topic either. So between two no fans, you get double trouble. So it's inevitable that the program is going to be closed down, mainly from that point of view. Now, I'm not saying that there were other issues here, but I'm saying those were the main aspects and the main reasons why the program was shut down. And then when that AIR, that American Institute of Research effort came in, or group was contracted to review the program, they only looked at a small sample of the later year projects. It did not look, and I'm getting this from inside sources because I wasn't directly involved in it at the time. And they only looked at the later year. They did not look at some of the really dramatic and valuable material that we did early on. So it was a forced thing that happened to shut it down. The management really didn't want it, and they found a way to have it transferred to CIA. And then the CIA, of course, was able to exert its clout and shut it down because now they had the control of it. So they were the boss. But only those last year or so that they really were practically managing the project, which really was almost nothing but an administrative thing. And then of course now we have the CIA files floating around. There's hardly anything in those files that came from CIA. These are all Department of Defense documents. It was just an administrative thing that happened where they stamped on the documents CIA numbers. So now you talk about misleading. These are not CIA documents. They just have a CIA control number on them. That's all. They're Department of Defense documents, most of them, probably 99% of them. It's like Ford borrowing a Chevrolet manual and stamping a Ford control number on it and saying, "Oh, here's a Ford manual. Here's a Ford document." So it's misleading, and people use that label because now they say, "Oh, look, I have the CIA document here." Well, that's fine. It's CIA. The CIA carries more clout, I guess, than the DIA in terms of publicity. Sorry, I digressed.
No, it's all right. That makes a lot of sense. So, why did you leave the program, the unit in '93? That would have been what 2 years or 2 or 3 years roughly before it shut down.
Oh, very simple. I'm a senior citizen. I
Hmm.
became qualified to retire. And it was really clear to me at the time what direction was happening because I already had been involved in the meetings with the DIA director that clearly said he didn't want to continue with this program. And of course, Dr. Verona had retired as well. And I think it was also through some political pressures that led him to retire. So it's really clear what was happening. So here I am now, and a few others just sort of standing alone, so to speak, for the topic. So how long can you last against that kind of bureaucracy? And I had the opportunity enough years in, and really seen a lot. I had a lot of good times and a lot of challenging times in the program, and I thought it was a good time to get out and do some writing and do some research and do something else for the rest of my earthly existence.
That makes sense. So do you have any information that or any speculation or anything that maybe this program continued in a different capacity, that maybe they found a different application for remote viewing and using psychics, and then they just opened up a different special access program within the military or within one of these three-letter organizations?
Well, I don't think a large effort will continue or is continuing, and I can't rule out the possibility that consultants were brought in from time to time. Actually, like we did for a while as well. People that already had been with the program, sometimes we brought back as a consultant for a certain project, for example, and they worked on an operational task. So I don't doubt at all that there were a few elements that kept that activity alive and brought a few of the former remote viewers in for select tasks. And it may be also that some of the research areas took a look at it as well. I know there's been an interest in intuition and related topics over DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency. Maybe something was going on over there, but that might have been through subcontracts, not through some direct bring people in and put them on the staff kind of thing. So yeah, I think that we got enough publicity out there and people that really have an understanding of the phenomenon to some extent will say, yeah, we'll give it a try, and maybe there've been some experimental work under very specific kinds of applications. Yeah, I'd be surprised. I'd be surprised if there isn't, but but I wouldn't expect a really large program, other than maybe something on the research side. But worked in with a variety of other topics related to physiology or bio type of work.
It would make sense that because it's evolved since kind of its inceptions, and they figured out different applications to use it for throughout all the time that they've been studying it and researching it. So it wouldn't be surprising to me if it evolved into something else and they figured out a different application for it, and they're still running those kinds of programs for it.
Yeah, or as an adjunct to something, not the main focus, but as something on the side. And yeah, of course, going back to the question of why did the program close down, because this is another factor, this is right after the Cold War, the Berlin Wall, and now you had people running all over Russia, and in fact, I was over myself after I retired and invited into one of the parapsychology laboratories in 1993. I had free access to Soviet research. I was right there looking at an experiment. The same kind of thing I've been trying to figure out over the years as an analyst at FTD or at the DIA. Here I am now in the Soviet Union, actually looking at this stuff. You don't need to have a psychic spy doing it. Invite yourself into the laboratory. So there are that was a factor too. And of course, that affected a lot of intelligence activities, not just what we were involved in, or a small piece. We just had a small piece when you look at the overall scope of what was going on during the Cold War. But with free reign in the Soviet Union and with travelers and scientists coming out at conferences and the management level not liking the topic in the first place. You can see why I kind of predicted an inevitable end to the program.
Yeah, I definitely think that it evolved into something from psychic spies into something way more sinister and way more intrusive. But that's just my personal thoughts, and that's where we're going to leave it here tonight. So let's talk about how remote viewing actually works and what the process of remote viewing actually is, because I've heard Ego talk about a separation of consciousness from the body that he endured whenever he was younger. And this is a very connecting piece and something that's very common within a lot of psychics and remote viewers is a trauma aspect, right? And Ego's whole thing was he was being bullied as a child for being gay, and that would induce these out of body experiences. And he said that, and these are, his words that he said is that uh, consciousness of the body can, whenever you have these out of body experiences, the consciousness of the body can go places that the body can't, implying that when you're remote viewing, your consciousness is separating from your body to view something outside of space and time. But then I had Stefan Schwartz on, and then he said that it has nothing to do with separation of consciousness from the body, that it's about unlocking and opening your consciousness. So what's your thoughts on this, Dale?
Yeah, well, my experiences with the phenomenon really also go back to childhood. Now, I certainly had a really great childhood and no abuse at all. I grew up in a rural area, but it was more a wilderness type thing. So I became really attuned to nature and the farm life, and had a lot of dreams. And I experienced lucid dreaming as a child. I never understood what the term meant until maybe 20, 30 years later. But in lucid dreaming, which I still experience frequently, because I'm a dreamer. I dream a lot. So dreaming itself, when you explore dreaming, it sometimes appears that you're leaving, you're leaving yourself. But I never really quite got to seeing it from that point of view. It's more like just shifting a frequency, shifting a frame of reference to maybe another part of the brain that's more receptive to the perceptions. So, from my point of view, from an experiential point of view, I don't think you really leave. I think it's a matter of you have to say if you want to say that, you have to define what is mind and what really is consciousness. So we have some big unknowns here, but I think it's a matter of how we move or shift around our internal frame of references. So when I go to sleep and start dreaming, I'm just another. It looks from a physiological point of view, it's difficult to tell when people are dreaming and when they're awake. So you're shifting to an internal frame of reference. And once you're on that internal frame of reference, then there's something that can access other information from like the future or that. Now, I don't see it as leaving the body. I think it's simply moving around to a different frame of reference.
It is really interesting though, Dale, that how that out of body experiences or near death experiences normally do play some kind of role in kind of unlocking these abilities, or some kind of trauma that involves them being younger, and then they have a more susceptible ability to tap in to remote viewing and psychic abilities, foresight, intuition. It's a very common thing that I really think that's being overlooked. Now, maybe it doesn't have anything to specifically do with your consciousness actually being removed from your body, but I think possibly that's one of the first things, um, because I think that we all do have these abilities, like you were stating earlier in the interview. We all have the abilities. Well, we might not all have the exact abilities, but we all have the ability to remote view, I think is a better way of putting it. But, looking at it from a trauma angle, and maybe these abilities have been suppressed within us through societal reasons, through indoctrination. Whenever you're a kid, you're telling people about these experiences that you're having. Maybe you're seeing things that aren't really there. Maybe you have an extrasensory perception of different realities, and maybe you're tapped in more. But then through society, it's been pushed down within us, and then that trauma or that out of body experience or that near death experience unlocks that ability again somehow.
Oh, I think there's a lot to what you just said. I would certainly go along with that. But even without those more dramatic abilities, long-term meditators often automatically have these experiences. You don't really need the trauma, although that certainly jump starts things. I agree, because then you get the shock effect. Oh, wow, how did that happen? I can't believe it. So now you readily accept the smaller things, the intuition, the hunches, the precognitive dreams, that kind of. So it just allows you to be more acceptable of this ability, and you can overrule then what you've been indoctrinated, like you were pointing out, from parents of society and other authoritarian sources. So it just gives you a better confidence level that what you're going to be working with has some validity, and you just move along and find out what's there and ignore what the naysayers say. The biggest problem I had was science and the negative aspects that many leading scientists have and still have on the overall phenomenon, and that really had a big effect on me. I had some get rid of that that chain and go back to what I remember from childhood and reignite some of the dreaming time that actually had precognitive information in it. So I was certainly not a skeptic when I became involved in the program. I'm not a skeptic of the phenomenon, but I was questioning just exactly what all can you do with it, and that's where the research part and the exploration part came in. But I agree with you. It's a lot of unusual experiences do increase an individual's tendency to move forward and accept the phenomenon and explore for themselves what they can do and what they can't do.
So you were having these precognitive dreams for a long time. You've been
Yeah,
having them since you were a kid.
yeah. Precognitive dreaming is actually, like, if I have a strong point, that's what it is, and that goes back to childhood. But I've actually done research specifically aimed at that, and with some colleagues, we've actually had some material published in peer-reviewed journals that look at precognitive dreaming. And I'm still doing work in this field. Um, and yeah, I just follow that. I can do this, and other people also. So it's something I experience, and it's something I try to put into a research package that can be quantifiable as well. And I've done that in a few instances. I still have an awful lot of unpublished work, and I hope I can get it published someday.
So what's your connection between, having these precognitive dreams and remote viewing and extrasensory perception. What's your thoughts on
Well,
that?
I'm a generalist, and I see all of this as connected. I don't like to separate them out, but it's convenient to do this for talking purposes. Um, Precognitive dreams may have a lot of material in it that's not what you might call psychic or ESP related. I'm talking about lucid dreams here, but they can also have dreams can also have ESP kind of information. And I see remote viewing, ESP, and other terms we use for this potential. It's all pretty much under the same umbrella. We just have a different way of spreading it out and understanding it and developing that. So I see it as, I like the term that the researchers use, psi phenomena. It takes care of the whole business. It's a generalized term. It says a lot of these words that we use describe an aspect of this overall ability that we have, ranging from intuition to clairvoyance to the later term remote viewing, in different ways of describing our psychic abilities.
Can you give an example of a dream that you've had that you've seen something that has actually happened in reality, or that you were warned about, or something that you've seen before it happened?
Oh yeah, a lot of them. And I do presentations, and I usually summarize one of them or more in the presentation. But one that occurred, well, the space shuttle was a big one. That was a dream a week ahead of time, 5 days ahead of time, before the space shuttle burned up. And that dream actually presented the whole scenario, the vehicle disintegrating. It even presented the cause of the catastrophe, the wing structure weakening. So I had that information 5 days before the accident or the tragedy actually happened. And at a personal level, not some years ago, a precognitive dream presented to me an accident on Interstate 83. I was traveling to the Ryan Research Center that weekend to do a presentation, and this dream presented the almost exact situation of the accident that I came upon 5 hours later, and the dream occurred 2 hours before the accident. So I was on the lookout for something that could be significant on that trip. So I was a lot more careful, and I may have actually got out of the accident because I slowed down more. So I don't know if it's yours, but those are some of the kinds of precognitive dreams. But a lot of them are kind of minor, little things that happen, little alerts, and they always overlap into what I call synchronicities. And then you have this really interesting coincidence happen. And maybe I dreamt about that happening. I just didn't remember it. So I missed out on a precognitive dream, but that didn't stop the future unexpected event to occur. And synchronicities are usually quite beneficial. They're nothing to be dreaded. So I see precognitive dreaming and synchronicity as sort of the same kind of phenomenon. Only in one case we don't remember it, the event still happens, and it's still different and unique from what we could have expected.
Yeah, that's really interesting too, because it's like, what are you personally supposed to do with that information, right? Let's say that let's say something really huge was going to happen next week, and tonight you,
Yeah.
like a worldwide scale, right? Something really big, and you dreamt about it tonight. Like, what are you personally supposed to do with that information? Are you supposed to alert someone? Is it just specifically for you? But then if it's just specifically for you, then why are you getting it?
Oh, I wrestled with that question for a long time. Now, a lot of the precognitive dreams that I've had are situations I will see, but they don't affect me directly as I read about them, maybe in the paper or hear about it on the news. Like 9/11, a lot of people had premonitions on that, including dreams, hunches, feelings. I also had a number of very vivid and exact dreams about that. But like you're saying, what could I have done? I couldn't do anything. First of all, they weren't specific enough to know exactly where or when. And even if I had known that, who would I contact? Or of all the aircraft accident tragedy dreams that I've had, and I've had about a dozen or so. There's no way I could have done anything about it. Who would I tell? Um, so then why do I have them? Well, I think it's of course I have a lot of small ones too, a lot of trivial ones, so it doesn't bother me too much. But having the big ones comes because it shows what we can do. I'm talking about as a group, as a large society. If we really put ourselves together and work together on this, and we could, in principle, have teams and pools of people that are on the alert for significant events like you're talking about. And then, yeah, okay, so if, say, 10 people or 50 people in a certain city all of a sudden in the same night have this catastrophe dream that affects their city, then maybe they can mobilize. Maybe there's enough other people in the chain of command and the police department that have learned about this ability, that they will at least pay attention to it and be on the alert. And if there's enough specifics to go out looking for it, if it's somebody about to blow up a substation like just happened in North Carolina, then maybe they can put extra guards up. Yeah, I've always been an advocate. You read about this is not a good topic maybe to talk about, but yeah, these school shootings. What would happen if the parents and the children that go to any school are alerted to pay attention to dreams? What would happen if a child would come to you, suppose your child came and your child said, "Oh, I had this really bad dream last night about this fire or explosion in the school or somebody coming in." Um, as a parent who knows dreams, I would first of all not send the child to school that day. And secondly, I would find a way to contact the principal to alert them to it and prevent it sounding like a coup, which could be a real problem. But if more people did this, then I think we could start avoiding some of these mass tragedies. I'm reminded of a situation I saw on television. CNN News was carrying the memorial after that building that was destroyed by McVeigh, I think, in Oklahoma City in 1995. And there's a woman being interviewed. This is like a year later, and the interviewer is talking to her at the memorial, and she's really naturally upset, but she goes on to tell the CNN reporter that she still has guilt because her husband that morning told her about this horrible dream he had about the buildings that were blowing up. And she said, "Oh, that's just a dream. You're just having a nightmare. Please, you're going to be late. Get going." Yeah, I got there in time to be blown up. So, his one little incident, but think how many more there could be like that, where if people paid attention, not just to children, which were more susceptible. Well, then there's the Aberfan incident in Wales when that huge mound of coal debris slid down and smothered about 30 school children. And there were dreams of people not even connected with that tragedy before it happened, and also of a school child that even told her mother about it. and still went to school and then died because she was caught up in the avalanche. So these are two of many examples, because I suspect there are a lot of people that have these, but don't know what to do with them, or are reluctant to talk about them. So maybe what we can do as a society as we move on, be more open about these abilities, because we've been talking about remote viewing here, and that's becoming more well known and more popular. If you check the internet, you find all kinds of links. But here I'm talking now about something that relates more to an individual at the individual home level, which should also be receiving this kind of attention and seriousness, because it could be life-saving. So in time, as say remote viewing becomes more well known, and as our own natural abilities become spread around more, which remote viewing counts in the material that's coming out or not help substantiate, then maybe at an individual level, you and I and others can say, yeah, we have these abilities. We don't have to go out and be a psychic spy, but we can do something to help ourselves and our neighbors and our fellow citizens. And so in the long run, I think working in the precognitive field, for me, is a really interesting way to look at the emergence of this field in the future, because it can be so important for anyone. And in my view, it's just an extension of intuition, which is making it a little bit more specific and more relevant in individual life, and which actually could be life-saving.
I agree. The phenomenon needs to be taken way more seriously and more attention brought onto it. And that's really what I'm trying to do. Dale, thank you so much for coming on my show. I appreciate you a lot, my friend. It was wonderful having the conversation. Would love to bring you back on sometime. Thanks for coming on and sharing your experiences in the Stargate project. And could you let people know where they can find your books online, or a website, or anything you would like them to check out?
Yeah, the book's out of publication, but Amazon still has some around, so they can check that out.
Do you have a website or anything that people that would like any kind of more information on about, or anything else that you would like me to put in the description?
Not really. No.
Okay, thanks so much, Dale. I appreciate your time here tonight. Like I said, I would love to bring you back on sometime in the future. We can keep going on this topic for a while. We could probably talk for another hour just on dreams and what all that stuff means. But again,
Yeah.
thanks so much for your time. Appreciate you a lot.
Okay.
For everyone else, thanks for watching and listening. Much love to everyone in the chat. Please be sure to hit the thumbs up button to help the channel out and the YouTube algorithms. Share, subscribe, hit the bell icon as well for notifications. And remember, we're not only in a spiritual war, but a war on humanity. Stay aware, stay alert, keep loving your heart for everyone. Stay safe out there. And if you can see through the illusion, you are the solution. See you guys next time.
All right.